Hello, everyone, and welcome to Science Communication, Research and Filmmaking, Building Bridges. I am in the beautiful Boston, Massachusetts today, and I think I'm going to start with acknowledging that I am currently in the original homeland of the Mashpee Wampanoag, the Aquinnah Wampanoag, the Nipmuc, and the Massachusetts tribal nations. My name is Rayhana Maktufi. I go by Ray. I'm a Rich Allen Foundation Civic Science Fellow, and I do research on science communication and misinformation, and I produce content on the science of science communication. Just to start, I think we're gonna do a mini vocabulary all check that when we talk about the science of science communication, it's basically anything that relates to communicating from our audiences, who is our audience, what is their demographic, what are their needs, their interests when it gets to science, what kind of effects our content that we produce has from curiosity to interest to changing behavior, wanting to conserve nature, or as it relates to climate change and other topics, and in general, measuring the impact of what we do. I recently finished my PhD and I moved from academia and doing science communication to industry. So it was very interesting for me to see how a lot of filmmakers and science communication researchers work together, or how filmmakers use science communication research in their work. And that is why today we have this amazing panel today with us. I'm just gonna do a 1% of their bios because everyone here is a superstar, starting with Sonia. So Sonia Pemberton is the creative director of Gene Pool Production. She's one of Australia's leading documentary filmmakers, an Emmy Award recipient and record-breaking 5-time winner of the prestigious Eureka Prize for Science Journalism. You might know her from films like Vitamins, Uranium, Twisting the Dragon's Tail, Jabbed, Love, Fear, and Vaccines Calling the Shots. Our next panelist is Dr. Dietram Scheufele. Dietram is a Taylor Bascom Chair in Science Communication and Willis Distinguished Achievement Professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and in the Morgridge Institute of Research. His work examines the social effects of emerging science and technology. He's the author and co-author of over 200 articles and monograms, and one of the most widely cited experts in the field of political communication, science communication, and science and technology policy. We also have Dr. Monica Feglio-Mujer with us. Monica is a scientist and science communicator who applies a cultural lens to science communication and storytelling to make science more equitable and inclusive. She's also the Director of Communications and Science Outreach for Ciencia Puerto Rico, and is also the Associate Director of Diversity and Communication Training for iBiology. Monica is also the lead producer of Background Through Breakthrough. Last but not least, Caitlin Sachs. She's a producer for the science series Nova on PBS. She's also a producer and co-host of Nova's digital series Antarctic Extremes, and host of its online companion game, The Polar Lab. You might also know Caitlin from her other climate-related production credit, including Decoding the Weather Machine and the virtual reality experience Greenland Melting. Welcome, everyone. I think I'm going to start with a general question for everyone. So as it relates to more controversial science topics, for example, climate change, GMOs, medical racism, I want to hear how science communication research or your collaborations has affected your work. And I would love to hear how that actually looks in the way you work or in the things that you have been producing. Should we start with Sonia?
Sure. Hi, thanks for having me. It's great to be involved in this panel. I guess our company, Gene Pool, we make global science documentaries that are focused on polarized issues, and we've always focused on areas where there's sort of concern, conflict, questioning, skepticism around the science. So we've done, we originally did Crude, as the story of oil. We've done vaccines, 2 vaccine films, Uranium, as you mentioned, Vitamins in Vitamania. We're currently doing climate change, carbon, genetics and CRISPR, and something else. I've forgotten my last one. So we're really embedded in this area where there are controversies or perceived controversies. And I guess the most obvious example of the one that we really, or it all started for me really, was Jabbed, Love, Fear and Vaccines. I wanted to make a film about vaccination. I come from a medical background, I come from a medical family. So for me, having hesitancy around vaccination was odd. I didn't understand it and I wanted to make a film. This was a few years ago now, 6 years ago. And what I discovered is there was two types of films. Films that were either pro-vaccine or films that were anti-vaccine, and I couldn't find anything sort of in the middle. And by in the middle, what I mean is allowing both sides to kind of be visible. And so I set off on this journey to try and create a film that might help cross the divide, as I like to put it. And I couldn't see anything out there that was doing that. And I got very lost, I got very depressed, I got very annoyed. I watched a lot of films that were anti-vaccination and they depressed me a lot. I watched really full-on pro-vaccination films and they depressed me a lot because people who are vaccine skeptics weren't watching. So I was going, what can we do? And I discovered a guy called Professor Dan Kahan at Yale. He has the Cultural Cognition Project. And he didn't answer my calls for 2 years, but I read all his stuff. I dug deep and really wrestled with it and tried to apply what I could learn from his teachings to that first film. Ironically, that film was screened at Jackson Hole and Dan was one of the speakers. And at that point, we got to meet each other at the end of that film process. And we've been working together ever since. And I've honed the things I guess I learned. And in a nutshell, what I discovered was I had to confront my own bias or my own pro-vaccine bias day after day after day after day after day. I had to confront that. I had to really try and understand what vaccine skeptics and denialists felt about the issue. I decided to include people on my team who were vaccine hesitant, and I even had some people on my team who were outright refusers, because I see vaccination as a spectrum rather than an either or I learned to see that. And I had to modify the tone and the approach and specific scenes in order to be able to speak to them. And I learned how I needed to speak to them. And I guess in essence, I learned to apply the science of science communication using evidence-based thinking around the making of the film. And by that, I mean, I tested it on audiences of vaccine hesitant parents. Like I said, I included people on our team who had hesitancy or were refusing vaccines. And I did some stuff that was considered pretty radical, I guess. And I did it deliberately, consciously, with full awareness and lots of checks in place. For example, we acknowledged that it's okay to be afraid of vaccines. That was really hard for some people, particularly our stakeholders. That was really hard. It was hard for me in the beginning to say it's okay to be afraid. It's what you do with that fear that matters. We also had to look at our language. I discovered from the groups that we screened to that the term herd immunity drove them nuts. And the second we got to the scene about herd immunity, if we used the term herd immunity, they switched off. We could watch it. We were filming them behind screens. We could see them. They all started looking at their phones, talking to each other. They just wouldn't pay attention. When I took that word, the terms, herd immunity out of the film, they watched the scene and got the gist of it. And we just noticed by studying this what actually worked to cross the divide. I also did things like I included a homeopath in the film. Now, there's not many films about vaccination where you'd expect to see a homeopath, and not just a homeopath, but the Queen's homeopath. Who knew Queen Elizabeth of England has a homeopath? But what was so interesting was he was pro-vaccination. And so what I was trying to do was speak to the people that were in the audience I was trying to reach. And so we did this very carefully. We did various versions of it. We tested those versions. We used what I would call Dan's approach, Dan Kahan's approach, which is test your hypothesis about how you think the communication's working and then measure it as best you can. We've got far more sophisticated with this now with Uranium, three-part series. We're using it on our climate change film at the moment. We're very much using it on our CRISPR and genetics series. So these days I've refined kind of some of those thinkings. But the essence of it is to apply evidence-based thinking to making films. And it shouldn't be radical, but at times it feels difficult and radical.
Thank you. Dietram, do you want to go next?
Sure. Well, and thank you so much for having us. I think this is a really important topic and one that's certainly been close to my heart for a long time. I'm now just reaching the point where I've spent as much time in the US as now a citizen as I've spent growing up in Germany. So I'm still nicely schizophrenic between the two cultures. But what was interesting to me is that I moved from a country that that solidly opposes the scientific consensus on genetically modified organisms to a country that solidly, or at least where good chunks of the population oppose the scientific consensus on climate change. And of course, you know, as if you look through the literature, you figure out pretty quickly that those are actually the exact same phenomena that are happening there. But more importantly, to your question, Ray, they both are issues where vulnerable populations are left behind very often based on decisions that less vulnerable populations are making. GM is a really good example where it's really easy for a German population to reject the development of certain crops that would benefit sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia as population growth hits new peaks in 2050 and 2100. And climate change, of course, is exactly the same, where certain populations can afford to ignore some of the implications of climate change that are going to hit hardest already vulnerable populations. So I think the urgency of the problem really was striking, that we're seeing this in across different cultures, especially over the course of my biography. And then I ended up at universities as an academic that all were land grant universities. So these are these universities that were created in the mid 19th century, in the middle of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln says, look, what we need to do is we need to invest not just in the research, but we need to make sure that that research gets translated and passed on. This is why we're granting land literally to the population to create real change. And so that's why I've always been in academic social science units that were housed in genetics, basically agriculture and life sciences colleges. And I think that's been extremely fruitful. And just piggybacking on what Sonia already said, I think one of the things that social science hasn't done, and the academic side of social science and the science of science communication hasn't always done well, is to conduct and frame and publicize its research in a way that makes it usable. And I think there are exceptions, and Dan is probably one. I think there are lots of others. But I think one of the key, I think, success stories in the work that our group has done is to connect with bench scientists, is to connect with filmmakers, is to connect with museums through grants that were very often funded by academic bodies like the National Science Foundation. But to really do this iterative back and forth between what does the practice demand in terms of research input and how does that inform our research process? And ultimately, I think it makes us ask better questions on the research side. It makes us focus more on the direct application of this work. And I don't mean this in a bad, we should only do applied translational research and not basic research, but I think it makes our basic research better. And so I think those iterative kind of partnerships, we're seeing more and more of those. The Rita Allen Foundation, who you mentioned earlier, funds some of those explicitly in partnership with the national academies. And so I think that's really an exciting pathway forward, because as Sonia said, you hypothesize, you think certain things will work out. And for herd immunity, there's really nice research on framing, for instance, that tells you that, look, unless the way you present a piece of information resonates with identity relevant mental schemas, it's just not going to go through. And a lot of people have asked that community immunity or other words that don't imply that you're part of a herd of sheep would be a much better way of talking about this. So I mean, exactly to the problem. This is why these partnerships are so exciting from a researcher end, because that is probably one of the best applications of framing that I've heard in a while. So again, thanks for having us.
Sure. It's wonderful to have you all here. Monica, can I ask you to go next?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be part of this panel. I'm a scientist by training. I'm a neurobiologist by training. And so taking evidence-based approaches is not, it's part of who I am. It's part of how I do things. However, I don't have specific or formal training in science communication. I kind of stumbled upon science communication while I was a science graduate student. I decided I was going to pursue that. And then as I started to dive deeper into science communication, I realized there's a whole field. There are multidisciplinary field that studies the science of science communication. And I think in terms of how I apply that to my work, there are three things. There's framing, which Deetran already mentioned. And then there, the general strategies that I use and how I tell stories. I don't remember where in my career this happened, but again, as a scientist, for me, data is very important, right? And scientists, particularly natural scientists, we tend to think data speaks for itself. Just show me the numbers, just show me the data, and I'll be convinced. And then we think that when we're talking to non-scientists, that is true, and it's not. And I think one of the, those aha moments when I was looking and starting to dive into the research in science communication is that values, emotions, culture, people's context, that really influences how they understand, how they value science, how they engage with it, how they use that information. And so I think that's been one of the most influential ideas from the science of science communication. And actually from multicultural science education, where there's some interesting overlaps with science communication there. And a lot of the work that I do is communicating science in Spanish, is communicating science to Puerto Rican and Latinx populations. And so instinctively, at least the cultural part, that came natural to me, but discovering like there's actually research that validates what you're doing. It was really mind-blowing. But then my work is essentially using science communication and storytelling to dismantle historical systems that marginalize certain groups of people. And so there's also research there that shows that stories can shift stereotypes and how people perceive, for example, scientists of color, scientists that come from historically marginalized backgrounds in the United States. And so, that's another piece of research that's been really influential. And so I would say that it's not one paper, but there are these concepts that have really shaped how I approach my science communication, and what type of evidence am I looking at, what type of information am I keeping an eye out, so that I can continue to make sure that the work that I'm doing, from training scientists to writing articles to producing films, that's based on the best science available in science communication.
Thank you, Monica. Caitlin.
Thank you. I just have to say it's such an honor to be on a panel with such renowned filmmakers and researchers. So thank you for having me. I work for NOVA on PBS, and I have worked extensively on basically all of our climate content, particularly for broadcast in the past 5 years. Most notably our film Decoding the Weather Machine, and then our multi-platform project Polar Extremes. So when approaching the topic of climate, I should say, first of all, that NOVA does not see itself in any way as an advocate. Our goal is not to advocate for any sort of action, but instead to educate, inspire, inform the public so that they can make their own decisions. That said, our goal is very much to reach the widest possible audience, and on a topic such as climate, it can be polarizing. Word choice can make an audience turn the television off before they even watch. And so a lot of what we've done, and a lot of what we've thought about at NOVA over the past few years, is how do we get past that? How do we actually get people to tune in and listen and engage on a topic where their mind may or may not already be made up? And that's when and why we turned to the literature, particularly in the development of Decoding the Weather Machine is when that started. And I'm very fortunate that we have a staff that, it wasn't just me or just, the producer or the filmmaker, but we had a big team who was collating this information. And it really informed from the ground up how we approached the making of those two tentpole films. So for Decoding the Weather Machine, it's a bit of it's a little, I guess, ironic. Much of the climate literature says, if you're going to talk about climate, don't talk about facts, don't present just the facts. And yet that's exactly what Nova wanted to do. And I will argue that because of the platform and who we were, and because of our audience, we bucked the sort of research wisdom only because we had a very, very unique and privileged platform where we're reaching an audience that spans political spectrums, that's interested in science and not necessarily a politicized audience. And so we felt that if we could at least get that audience in the door and watching, they're also the science curious audience, so interested in engaging with that science facts. But that said, we decided to choose our characters very carefully, such that we wouldn't alienate the audience that might be skeptical about climate change. We opened the film with a weatherman from an evangelical weatherman, very specifically to engage that portion of the population that, particularly a few years ago, I think this is we're seeing movement, was climate skeptical, to get them in the door, get their foot in the door, and start actually thinking about the topic, and then bringing them on a path of discovery instead of just presenting the facts or waving fingers. So decoding the weather machine's approach was very much to choose its characters carefully, but present the science. Our next film, which was really a multi-platform project, was Polar Extremes. That included a 2-hour broadcast film with hosted by the SANT director of the National Museum of Natural History, Kirk Johnson, as well as a YouTube series, Antarctic Extremes, which I produced and hosted, and a game, an interactive game designed for kids. And the really exciting and key and crucial thing there is that we had 3 pretty different audiences. And one of the most crucial things to understand about communicating on any of these topics is to really know what audience you're trying to reach. It is extremely, extremely, extremely difficult to reach all audiences and do everything for everyone with one piece of content, because people are coming from different places and they need, if you're trying to reach them, they are looking for different things. My nieces and nephews like something very different from what my parents will watch and engage with. So what was exciting about that project is that we were actually reaching audiences that more or less broke down along age guidelines, and we were able to employ strategies that spoke to each one of those. The broadcast was much more of an adventure film, and we had a lot of debates in the office of like, how much do we talk about, how much do we say the C word, and how much do we just pretend it's adventure into deep time and deep history. The YouTube series did not shy away from mentioning climate, but also kind of assumed that the audience already believed in climate, that the audience already understood that climate change was happening and was real for the most part, that it would be a small minority of the audience that didn't, and really aimed to inspire them to engage with actually what it's like to do the science, and hey, how can you be part of this adventure to try and solve this problem? And then the game was a much more sort of educational, sort of rubricked kind of experience.
Thank you, Caitlin. So building off of what you told me, so Sonia, you were saying, for example, it was hard to get access to the researcher. Deetram, you also talked about translational research is a little, sometimes people don't get it out of the door, or there are the different barriers. So generally, I want to know, what do you all think, what are the challenges when either working with a filmmaker or with a researcher as it relates to your own work, to your funders, to your stakeholder, to your audience? What are your thoughts?
I think for me, the hardest thing always was confronting my own bias. I struggled with that so much in the beginning. It's so easy to see other people's bias. It's so hard to see your own and to really get it. You know, I remember a particular day on the vaccine film where I'd just spoken to a father who really believed that his daughter had died because of the HPV vaccine, a human papillomavirus vaccine. She was 16 years old and she had committed suicide. It was a really tragic story, awful story. And I spent maybe an hour on the phone. He was in America, and an hour on the phone with him. And I remember I got off the phone and I lay on this desk and I cried. And I just went, how do I ever help this man see that 16-year-olds get depressed and, you know, have anxiety issues? And I just thought I wanted to give up. I said, there's no way through. And I think that moment was an epiphany for me, because I've never forgotten it, because I realized that I had to treat everyone from that point on with respect. This is a challenging idea when you really don't agree with them. You know, this person absolutely believed the vaccine killed their child. And so there was a shift that occurred in me on a really deep level, and it stayed with me now, whatever, 6-7 years later, about coming to these conversations. At the moment, I'm dealing with the climate skeptics, coming to the conversations with, sorry, there's a lot of birds here. I hope that's not a problem. A very early morning. Coming to these conversations with a sense of we're all in this together, but we're different. We're different. Acknowledging that difference. You know, I used to think that crossing the divide to speak to people was about just finding common ground. And I've realized it's not. It's finding common ground and acknowledging the differences between us, because I can't lie. I can't pretend that I don't think vaccination's a really good idea and a really sensible idea. But at the same time, I have to acknowledge that there are risks, there are fears, and how are we going to deal with that? The risks are very, very small, but they're real. So how do we move forward truthfully and in shared kind of companionship on these journeys? And so for me, confronting my own resistance to even hearing their stories was the hardest thing. And the second thing is, and I'm going to be really blunt here, is stakeholders, people who invest in your films, who want to get the films on the networks. They say they get it, but they don't. They really don't get it. What it takes to really cross the divide is really difficult. And your film has to go out on a limb. So in vaccines, for example, we had 3 stories of genuine vaccine injuries. It took me 4 years to find them, 4 years, because genuine evidence-based vaccine injuries where you can show that they are correlated, and that they're not causal, but they're correlated in time, and the doctors can support this, was really hard. But opening the films with those stories was really important if the audience was to trust us. And we've had similar experiences on uranium, and now we're dealing with climate. So for me, confronting my own bias and dealing with the people who are stakeholders around you, and really trying to help guide them to see it's worth taking the risk of complicating your communication message. That's really hard.
And maybe jumping off of that, the idea of different cultures, and Ray, to your question, you know, to which what are the difficulties in collaborating also between the social sciences and communities of practice? And I think there's at least a couple. One certainly relates to the idea that the incentive systems are very, very different, right? And you know this as well as anybody, Ray. But if in academia, the incentive system, of course, is focused very much around an invert conversation toward high impact journals, and much less so toward the outside, which means as we move up from assistant to associate to whatever professors, the ability and the willingness to work with other communities of practice on applied problems gets trained out of you more and more and more. You get better and better at not doing that. That's what gets your promotion and a salary increase. And then number 2 is, I think that flips around, of course, that I think, you know, we've all now talked about how we know that knowledge doesn't matter, but we've also just spent the last 5 months complaining about why misinformation is the biggest problem surrounding Corona. Right, so we keep falling back into, and especially when it comes to different communities of practice, into a theory that just deserves to be right. It deserves to be true that people make decisions based on knowledge. But of course, we know that they don't wear masks because they don't know any better, or that they don't socially distance because they don't know any better. And so there's lots of different intuitions in different communities that all deserve to be true, but bringing them together is really difficult. And I think for me, what's really been, and this is a totally trivial and non-original insight, but I think it's actually a really important one. And that is that collaborations need to be with people that you really work well with, where you trust to actually them to tell you when you're really off, and when all the things that you know you're really good at within your own community just doesn't work for the other community. Again, that sounds trivial, and it is, but it actually is a really important prerequisite for getting us out of that weird thinking, especially when it comes to those intuitive things that we all think are true, and fall back on every single time.
I want to echo what Sonia said. I think one of the real challenges is your stakeholders. If your broadcaster does not understand the academic research and why including this soundbite or including this character is going to help you reach an important audience, then they say take it out, and you don't have, you're working for them. You've got to take it out. I've run into a few situations. Nova is in some ways the broadcaster, but working for certain producers where they don't understand why it might be worth including a certain perspective, because in their lived experience, which is as a producer making good television that gets high ratings, that's getting in the way of the story or something like that. Which is also a valid perspective in some ways, but reconciling them can be really, really hard. Reconciling the sort of academic knowledge of what should help reach new audiences and the job of making TV. And I think the other thing that's just super, super important is the idea of empathy. And this gets to Sonia's point about, you might not agree with who your subjects are, but respecting that they have a way of knowing the world that is valid. It might not agree with yours. It might not agree with the scientific consensus or the scientific establishment, but that doesn't, but it still has value. It still means something to them. And so you need to find a way to talk to them with that, like from that perspective.
Yeah, I'm going to go a little bit in a different direction, kind of a selfish direction. As I mentioned, my work is really focused on equity and inclusion. And there is, Dieter mentioned that there is, and I think Ray, you mentioned this as well, there is the challenge of the science communication research. Like I don't know how many times I've read a paper, and I've read it, 5 times, and I'm like, I don't know. And English is not my first language, so sometimes I'm like, is it because I don't get the English? And then I go to the dictionary and I'm like, no, it's just they don't. The irony of communication researchers not being able to communicate. So that's a big problem. But in terms of the particular work that I do, there's so little research in terms of the cultural considerations that go into communicating science, particularly when it comes to marginalized populations. And so for me, it's very hard to be like, oh, I'm going to look at what the evidence says, because I'm sure there's evidence. There's just hasn't been any formal studies done or published, at least. So, that's a really big challenge. I'm a practitioner. I'm not a researcher. And there's, I think in terms of the practice of science communication, that is way more advanced when it comes to inclusion and equity than the actual research is. And yeah, there's cultural differences between researchers and practitioners and how we approach our work and the incentives, but there's also not a lot of opportunities to do work together. A lot of the funding is for researcher, a lot of the funding is for practitioners, but there's very little to actually work together in general. And then when you look at that kind of niche space where I am, there's almost nothing.
Yeah, it's built up.
Sorry.
One of the things that I sort of lament is that for all that we've done in trying to incorporate the research into how we make our climate films, we don't actually have any data on, you know, all we have is our ratings, and we don't actually have any, you know, study groups. I think Sonia, you are at least able to manage that with Jabbed, but
yeah, we built it into the budget. We had $200,000 that went into studying it alongside. We had a team of scientists from 2 universities who tracked it and tracked what we were doing, measured Australia's attitudes to vaccination before and after. We were able to show that we moved the dial a bit. I've got to say it's moved back. But we're involved in a whole big project at the moment to do it again. You know, we were able to measure that, you know, 9 to 12, depending on your numbers, 1,000 people queued up in the next week to get their kids vaccinated. We were able to study why they were resistant. You know, there was all sorts of methodology we could put in around it. And I've got to say, I'm involved in a really big project that I'm going to show off for a second. Got published in Nature, sorry, in Science yesterday. I am, for the first time in my life, a published science author. But anyway, we got published in Science yesterday, where we are building this thing where we're looking at gene editing, genome editing, and includes GMO, dietrim, and the stuff you were talking about. And we're putting it to the people, building a whole series of deliberative events and using the idea of citizens' assemblies and citizen juries. We've now got 7 funded around the world, and there'll be 12 national juries, including Brazil, mainland China, Africa, 3 parts of Africa. And we start in April. And then there's going to be a big global jury. And so this is about looking at the science of communicating gene editing and what we feel about it across cultures, again, across groups, with a science team that's not just going to measure the outcomes of the actual deliberation process, but going to measure the effect of the films that we're making. So there's 2 prongs to this science research, and we've got funding for this. It's a lot of money. And it's a huge event to do exactly, Monica, what you're talking about, which is to try and bring together the science, what we know about the science, what the people, how they react culturally across all these different groups feel about the science. And we're going to make a film about that process. And then the scientists are also going to study the film. And it's a 5-year project of following the whole process. And it's very complicated, so far too much to go into right now. But it's exactly the idea of how do we really look at what effects we're having with our films and our communications. Do they work? You know, I've been doing this a while, and to be honest, I have become increasingly skeptical in recent years. Obviously, the state of the world does not inspire confidence. And so I'm going, are we all wasting our time? I'm desperate to know if we can do things better. I'm desperate. You know, I just want to find ways that we improve the communication of science, you know, that we find ways to help people feel less fearful and to feel more empowered across all sorts of groups. So I'm doing a rant, but that's really my focus, is saying, you know, how do we combine the science, the communication, and get good information out there as broadly as possible. You know, we can reach 20, 30 million people with our films. Most of our films over a 10-year period reach about 20, 25 million people. Well, one broadcast in China will get us a very large proportion of that. But it's very hard to measure it. And so I think more and more tools are required to measure if people are understanding and comprehending what we're talking about.
Can I use that to really quickly jump back to what Monica was talking about, because I think it's actually a really important point we want to spend a little bit more time on, and that is the idea that how little research there is available, or there is currently, and how little money there is available to look at what seems like smaller, vulnerable populations. But I think COVID in particular has shown us how deeply important those populations are, not just because they're more susceptible to the virus, or because there's circumstances in where they live and how they live and other types of characteristics. But as we're looking for interventions, we know we're sitting here right now and we're saying, well, we're not getting enough minority populations, for instance, into these early vaccine trials. Well, that's not very surprising historically, number one, but it's also not very surprising given exactly what Monica just described, meaning how little research we've done in actually meaningfully engaging with populations that may be small in terms of percentages in the population and may be difficult to reach with research and more expensive to reach. But the small investment or the relatively maybe outsized investment that we could have made in establishing that body of research in the last 10 years would pay off tenfold now in our ability to very quickly build up capacity in terms of testing for populations that we know will need those vaccines at a disproportionate rate. So I think we're living right now the proof for the investment that Monica is talking about. And so I do think that's actually a non-trivial issue. And CRISPR, what Sonia just mentioned, also a really good example where some of the early applications of CRISPR, of course, are things like sickle cell disease that disproportionately affect people of Middle Eastern and African American descent. And we had a very interesting back and forth at one of the National Academies panels that we did around science communication between Matt Porteous, who's a pediatrician at Stanford, and Rick Weiss, who runs Sidelines for AAAS and used to write for the Washington Post. And Rick asked Matt, don't you think it's a bit problematic to try out a new technology on African Americans first, given what we've done in the past? And Matt's answer that I thought was actually a very intelligent and thoughtful one was, well, don't you think is that we make new technology, we figure out ways of making new technologies available first to populations that need them the most, and don't start with our typical white male populations first. But you can see the merit to both arguments. And again, I think that highlights the how many unresolved questions we have in that space. And I don't think we've done a very good job either on the research side, I think more so on the practice side, but certainly not on connecting the two. And so I just wanted to highlight that because I think it's actually a truly important point.
Yeah, and I think, if we started with a question about controversial topics. If you think about CRISPR, if you think about GMOs, if you think about, COVID, if you think about climate change, all of those issues, every single one of them affects disproportionately more these marginalized populations, every single one of them. And I think, if you ask me why that is, and if I wanted to be very simplistic, I have two words for you: systemic racism. But, we don't have time to explore that very deeply, but just keep that in the back of your mind. I think fundamentally, and shameless plug, I just wrote a piece for environmental communication, the journal Environmental Communication, about this, particularly as it comes to CRISPR, but I think it applies more widely. Fundamentally, science and science communication and the science of science communication, every single one of those systems or disciplines, we fail to center these marginalized populations. Just the framework and the ways that we're approaching this often is about putting, it's an afterthought to think about these populations. We just don't think about it because, science has been predominantly Western and white, and all of that permeates through the way that we do everything. And so I think it's very, very important to reframe, to start thinking about how do we reframe our approaches to questions. So, instead of thinking about testing things on people, how about we think about, how do we bring those populations to the table? Dietram provided the example of sickle cell disease and African American populations in the United States. How about we actually include researchers from those populations and patients from those populations from the get-go, from the design of the research to how we're going to communicate it. How about we do that? I think if we did that, if we shifted who we center in the research that we're doing and how we're communicating things I would hope will be different.
And ditto on the filmmaking side, engaging with those populations, not when you go out to shoot the film, but when you are researching how to shape the film, when you are researching what the film even is, beyond, you're assigned a topic or coming up with a topic, really engaging with those populations to get their perspective at that stage.
And just one small side story on this. I teach a class of about 190 students, all undergrads in science and media and society. And I ask them as an attendance quiz every year to give me just 5 terms that come to mind when they think about a scientist. So to speak to Caitlin, to your point about, you know, who do you include as voices? And then I wordle that all together and bring it in the next day to talk about something that we in science communication research call cultivation. So this idea that our view of what the world looks like, especially if we can't observe it in science, for many of us is that we don't observe it directly, we see it through media and other things. And so what kind of views are cultivated? And then I put that word cloud up in class, and it's white, male, crazy hair. These are students who work with scientists every day. They work in labs, they see professors, they know that these people don't look like Sheldon Cooper and Doc from Back to the Future had a child together, right? But that's still in their head because of how powerful that image is that they keep saying. And then a lot of it seeing, and a lot of that is entertainment media and not documentary films. So I think it's an unfair characterization, but it just shows the power of who speaks and who is being portrayed in terms of what then shapes later on what all of us think a normal quote unquote scientist looks like, and so on. So just to illustrate your point, Caitlin.
And thank you. And I'm thinking on the CRISPR example. One of the challenges is that this work is hard, especially if it's a topic that you're not familiar with, or you don't know, you don't actually understand yet the perspective of others. I just worked on a CRISPR film, a short doc that aired last week, in which we really wanted to feature someone from the deaf community. There was news, I guess, last year that one of the things that a Russian scientist was trying to edit out with CRISPR was deafness. And as you can imagine, the deaf community was like, hey, wait. As a filmmaker, the initial thought was, oh, okay, let's see what they're going to say, talk to them. But it was a challenge because suddenly there were a whole lot of new things that I didn't know how to do. How do I interview somebody who's deaf in a pandemic, no less? How do, and I made so many different mistakes that was just so humbling and embarrassing, learned so many things, how to speak the language you're supposed to use. And I wanted to just be respectful and really try to elevate their perspective. But in so doing, I had to just eat humble pie over and over and over again. And so I think one of the challenges with this work is that you've got to make mistakes and be willing. You've got to be willing to make mistakes and not afraid to make mistakes, because what you're doing is you're putting yourself out there and exposing yourself to uncomfortable things that are not your perspective.
Absolutely. I plus one that so much. And I have 2 things that I want to add. One thing, Dietram, you mentioned who is being portrayed, but it's also how. Because I think, again, particularly with scientists who are not male, white, cisgender, that, if you're talking about women and how if women scientists and how they're portrayed, or scientists of color and how they're portrayed, I produced a series of short films that precisely wants to change the way that people think about scientists of color. And when I was actually creating this series, one of the things that really struck me, and that I knew from my personal experience, but it didn't crystallize until I was actually producing the series of films, is that when it comes to scientists of color, you're often seeing these stories of deficit. It's like you overcame all of these things and hooray, you became a scientist. Instead of, sure, you endured certain challenges because of your background, because of the historical marginalization of your multiple identities, but you became a scientist because of who you are. And it's who you are that actually makes you an outstanding scientist. Like that kind of thing, I hadn't seen until I decided we're going to produce these films. And to your point, Caitlin, of eating humble pie, I think that's something that's really, really important for filmmakers. And that's something that I think a lot about myself. because, you know, I sometimes I hear people talk about like, oh, I want to give voice to these marginalized populations who've been voiceless. They haven't been voiceless. They just haven't been given the mic or the stage. And so I, as a filmmaker, I think about, how do I do that? How do I use the privileges and the access that I have to actually give the stage to people whose stories should be known, who have valuable knowledge and insights, but often they're not out there. I think a lot about that, and I think that's a really important point, to be humble and to accept that you will make mistakes and be okay with that.
I'd love to add something there. I'm working with an Indigenous group here in Australia, a team who are making their first film, and it's a science film. It's about mathematics and Indigenous knowledge, and it's hard, right? It's maths. Maths is hard, I reckon. Sorry, my bias. But what's really interesting is I have found myself having to resist my urge to imprint my kind of storytelling on their storytelling. And likewise, I've had to be really kind of conscious of that and be humble in the face of they want to tell their story a certain way. And all I am is a facilitator of their story. But what's so interesting for me, and I used to have a job at the ABC, our ABC here in Australia, and one of the departments I ran was the Indigenous department. And I learned to sit back and go, wow, there's different storytelling styles here. And when you impose the Western white narrative onto it, it falls apart sometimes. You know, the lyricism, and they circle stories differently, and they don't have a 3-act structure, and you know, there's just a whole different ways of telling stories. And I made huge mistakes in the beginning of trying to imprint what I thought was the way to tell a story, and I'm throwing that out the window now. All these years later, I've learned that. But with this team, it's really interesting them looking at them doing a science documentary rather than a social documentary, and bringing a whole other set of knowledge to it. And I've got to tell you, it's beautiful. It's really beautiful. So I hear you, Monica. You know, I really kind of go, okay, maybe there's a different way of telling a science film again. I mean, I already know there's 25 million different ways of doing it, but here's another lot. And it is very humbling and really exciting. Gives me such hope.
And when you're talking about science communication and reaching new audiences, realizing that these different kinds of storytelling are helping in you know, reach those audiences, like that's how you create more inclusive content, or content that reaches you know, those sorts of communities.
I had no idea that Indigenous people are supposedly here in this country can't do maths. I didn't realize that was a myth. I didn't realize that was a cultural phenomenon in this country. I was just oblivious to it. I've never even stopped to think that an Aboriginal person can't do mathematics. But they tell me they hit this all the time. They get told that they're not good at maths. And I thought, wow. And so here they're showing a 20, 30,000 year old mathematics system that we're completely oblivious to. I'm going, this is incredible. Let them tell the story. I'm just going to help you raise the money. You know. Anyway. It's a big story, big issues.
This has been a wonderful conversation, and I'm learning so much. And let's say someone is watching this panel, and by the end of it, they're like, this is great. I want to start collaborating with a science communication researcher, or start learning more about science communication, or find a way to build those bridges. Caitlin, we had a fun conversation about that. Do you mind if I start with you and ask, what do you think is a good way to just get started with that?
Oh, I forget what I said in our conversation.
You told me Google it.
Oh yeah. I mean, it kind of depends on your topic, who's doing the research in your on your topic area, but yeah, Google it. Look, I've been very lucky that you know, Nova has a large network and staff of producers who have connections, but honestly, it's not that hard.
I'll jump in. I mean, I honestly, the way that I started kind of dipping my toes into this was Twitter. I started, you know, I joined Twitter and I was kind of lurking for a while, just kind of seeing what conversations were happening. And it so happens that there's a really big science communication community on Twitter. There's a big community of practitioners. There's not as big a community of researchers, because I just don't think there's that as many researchers. But that's where I find a lot of the research, where I follow people like Dietram and Dominique Brozard, and like there's so many others that I follow their work. But you also get to see their thoughts real time. What are the things that they're paying attention to? So for me, that was the entry. And now one of the things that I do is I train and I mentor a lot of young scientists. And when they ask me, what's the one thing that I wish you had known? I tell them, I wish I had known there was science communication research earlier in my career. But I'd say, go to Twitter and find this community. If you search for hashtags HiCom, that's a good place to start.
And I think the other thing that does is, we have this same thing in academia every so often, where people are saying, how do I connect with communities of practice? How can I work with filmmakers and so on? And my recommendation is usually and Twitter is a good tool for that. That's why I'm mentioning it. Find what sociology is called the weak ties in networks, right? So the people that are sitting between two networks that are already doing this work, the filmmakers that are already paying attention to the Dan Kahans and others of this world, or the researchers who are already having grants with the Museum of Science in Boston or with iBiology or whoever else, and find them in your community, because they are going to be your gateway to the other community. And they're going to have made all the mistakes. They have eaten the humble pie, and you may not have to eat that same humble pie again, just different ones then. And I think that's true from both ends. So I think finding those weak ties those weird ones in a very good way is actually one of the strategies.
And I think if I was starting again looking into this, I guess I'd separate off two types of science communication. We've all heard about science communicators. Every university has them, every department has them. There's a difference between people who just do the job of science communication as a form of outreach for institutions, and the people who study the science of science communication. So I would specifically go looking into that, the science of science communication, because that's where the information bubbles up. If you did Twitter or a Google search, you're going to find the science of science communication across the board. And the other thing I guess I would do is I would be looking at ideas around tribal identities. And by tribal, I kind of just mean who you think your tribe are, and there's so much research into that. Daniel Kahneman, never mind Dan Kahan, but Daniel Kahneman and his work. There's so many people who've done wonderful work on how we think is related to what tribe we think we belong to, and the multiple tribes we belong to. So I guess becoming aware of that kind of research, I wish I'd done that earlier. And the other thing I would do is be really comfortable with accepting and acknowledging uncertainty. I used to look for certainty. I used to look for absolutes. I wanted a film or a conversation around a subject to have certainty. I've had to get really comfortable with uncertainty and complexity. I really like it now, but I didn't when I started.
And follow all of the panelists here today. Thank you so much, everyone. This was such a fun chat. I hope we get to do this again.
Same here. Thank you.
Anytime.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.